record. All right, the recording has started, and I will pass it over to you, Gregory.
Cool. Thanks, Melissa. And good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I see everybody's trickling in the chat. So the conversation of hydrogen is very nuanced. We got a lot to talk about, and there's certainly a lot we could even really hammer down on. But today, just wanted to give you sort of a brief overview and introduction to hydrogen and how to think about it as a sort of potential climate solution. And as you'll hear me, I'm going to try to use my words very carefully when I talk about this, because again, it's a very nuanced topic and there's a lot going on and there's a lot happening very quickly in trying to define it and define its best uses. So, I look forward, we'll have a Q&A session after the presentation, and I hope, you all will kind of chime in and we can have some good conversation then. But with that, I'm going to jump right into the presentation. And yeah, please continue adding into the chat. I'll definitely look at that a little bit later. All right, here we go. Can you all see that, Melissa? Yeah? Okay, cool. So let me go into full screen mode. So here we are today. So again, with this agenda, hopefully I'm trying to keep it 20-25 minutes, but I was timing myself not too long ago and I was getting up to 30. So I'll do my best here so you guys don't get bored. But start off with a quick PSR intro for those that don't know who we are, and then we'll get into this sort of what I'm calling Hydrogen 101. I'll give you some basic facts and kind of that sort of lay a foundation for the rest of our conversation and to think about hydrogen. Then I want to pose a real world scenario, something that's very much happening right now and is being discussed, and to help, I guess, frame some of these considerations and foundational knowledge around hydrogen. Then from there, we'll go into some last considerations and Q&A. So for those that don't know, Physicians for Social Responsibility, we're a national organization founded in 1961. The sort of initial purpose was really driven by nuclear weapons. And we actually won the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize for our work on that topic. Over the years, we've sort of adopted other existential threats to humanity, and certainly climate change and public health are one of those issues, and we have an environment and health program. So that's what I work under, and this is again for the national chapter. Like Sierra Club, we have many state chapters, and in California we have 3 specifically: Los Angeles, San Francisco Bay, and Sacramento. And also just want to give a quick shout out to our SFA chapter, Marjane, Julie, Bob. Thank you so much for helping put this together with Melissa. But they are the ones that are working very hard on this topic locally, where you all are. I'm personally based in California too, but in Los Angeles. So, it's a statewide issue, but there's regionally, it's becoming a lot more nuance in that. The main premise behind PSR and again, my work, and something I just really want to lay the groundwork for this presentation, the rest of our talk, is this climate crisis is a health crisis. Like that motto, slogan, however you want to call it, is something we fully embrace, something we truly believe in. I don't think I need to spend my time today telling you about the various climate impacts, whether we're talking about wildfires, the extreme heat, air pollution from burning or extracting fossil fuels. All these things have a very tangible and real health impact. And when we talk about climate change, we must also talk about public health. And when we talk about solving climate change, we must also talk about solving public health issues. In our mind, they're one and the same, and we need to always bring those two together. Again, addressing it, but also talking about it. So just want to lay that as sort of the premise here. And today, again, we're talking about hydrogen. We're looking at very doom and gloomy scenario for the next 10 years or a couple of decades of climate impacts, but everyone is trying to work very hard to decarbonize, to go zero emission, to go negative emission, whatever you might call it, but how do we get there, right? There's a lot of potential. You all know about solar energy, you know about electric vehicles. Well, hydrogen is now it's been around. It's not something brand new, but it's definitely gotten more of the spotlight recently. So what is hydrogen? Hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe. So some very basic facts. It's number one on the periodic table. As a gas, its stable form is H2. So when you see in literature or just writing, if they're referring to H2, it's pretty much hydrogen. It's the same thing. It's not something new, even though technically or in chemistry it might be. It's pretty much for our purposes the same thing. As a gas, it's colorless and odorless, and this is important we'll get into a little bit later. It's also a very flexible fuel, and this is part of why it's being sold as sort of this really catch-all solution, because it can store energy, it can move it, and it can deliver it pretty well. And with this flexibility, it can also be produced using different sources of energies or feedstock, and it can be done in a variety of techniques. So again, very flexible. It has some potential here. Currently, most of hydrogen is being used for ammonia, petroleum production and refining. There's a nice slice for methanol as well. So really heavy industry, chemicals, but there's also a small sliver that is being used for other sources. And in California, some of you may have seen maybe hydrogen fuel cell vehicles on the road. That's also, a proven technology that's been around now for a number of years and something California has pushed for a while. So there is a small 10% that's being used for other sources, but again, majority is being used for sort of heavy chemicals and refining and manufacturing. Why are we talking about it? So there's three things I want to touch on. One, hydrogen can be produced in a way that produces zero emissions. It's not the only way, but there is a way to produce it in that way. Some hard to electrify, and I'm using quotations here. This is a little vague, and we'll get into that, but some hard to electrify industries may be able to leverage the zero emission hydrogen to decarbonize their sector. And then lastly, money. There's a lot of money getting put into hydrogen right now. And this is most notably being led by the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure bill, which included $9.5 billion towards the research and development of 4 regional clean hydrogen hubs, they're calling. And essentially each one has a different sort of requirement of the type of feedstock they want used in each. So I'll go through each 3 of these points now. First is it can be produced in a way that zero emissions, right? Well, again, and this is going to the feedstock and the method of production.
Gregory, I think you're
but anyways, we'll get through the 3 points right now. So colors of hydrogen. So this is broadly what's referred to in the industry, right? We're talking about hydrogen, we talk about the color. This again describes the feedstock of hydrogen and the technique. So with these 3 right here, gray, blue, and green, in my mind, sort of the main colors, if you will, but there's a whole rainbow, a whole spectrum of colors. So gray hydrogen takes natural gas, methane, goes through a steam methane reformation process, produces hydrogen. You pollute, CO2. It's pretty dirty, right? It's pretty much, fossil fuel extraction, production, bad stuff. Blue hydrogen, that has been sold as something a little bit cleaner, and something that it can be zero carbon or zero emission. And this takes same thing, same process, natural gas, SMR, but instead of releasing the carbon, you capture it. So it uses CCS or carbon capture sequestration technologies, and you permanently try to store the hydrogen underground, and you produce hydrogen. There are some questions about the validity of those claims, and recently a paper from Stanford and Cornell looked into blue hydrogen and said, you know what, it actually isn't as clean as they're making it out to be. It can be just as dirty as just pure natural gas. So some real questions there, and let alone banking on unproven CCS technologies. Then the last one is green hydrogen. And this is the zero emission way I referred to earlier. So this takes water, green electricity, usually from renewable energy, right? Solar, wind, and you go through a process called electrolysis. You produce hydrogen, and you don't. The only emissions are technically oxygen and water. So you're not producing anything polluting in that sense. It's clean. It's a way to do it. There's still some considerations there. And the last one I'll also say is pink hydrogen, which uses electrolysis just like green hydrogen, but that sort of green electricity arrow, instead of renewables like solar and wind, you're using nuclear energy to power. Potential applications. So again, there are some sectors that of our economy that just don't have viable electrification solutions at the moment. So in other words, battery technology isn't yet practical for their use. This is something like aviation, long haul trucking, shipping, cargo handling, like at the port with some heavy duty machinery. It's again just not practical at this moment, and there's sort of a big question mark of like, okay, how do we really transition these to zero emission fuels? And hydrogen, again, potentially if it's produced in a green way, could play that role. There's also steel production or manufacturing where there are heat pumps, but they need a very high and hot and consistent flame. So a fuel makes a lot more sense. And again, in that sense, maybe that is replaced by zero carbon fuel like hydrogen. So there are some potential applications here where, again, there's kind of these pieces in our economy that we kind of have a question mark over. How do we get there? Batteries, don't get us there currently. So can hydrogen play that role? Maybe. And then to that point around dollars and investment, there is a lot of money going on. And again, with the hydrogen hubs application process that's currently ongoing, there was an RFI earlier this year. There's going to be the first phase of applicants being submitted, I think, at the beginning of next year. This is all very real, happening in real time. And where I am, SoCalGas has put forward a proposal around, as they call it, the Angeles Link proposal. And this is to build out a network of green hydrogen pipelines. In Northern California, PG&E recently announced a blending research facility in partnership with UCR and a few other folks to specifically test out blending hydrogen and methane to decarbonize existing methane pipelines. So very real, a lot of real applications happening right now, and steps that are being taken to try to get this investment. The other thing to note from the federal side is the Hydrogen Shot Initiative. And this is an investment to get 1 kilogram of hydrogen, clean hydrogen, to $1 in 1 decade, or known as 111. Currently, 1 kilogram of hydrogen is about $6. It was at 10 to 15 a few years ago. So there's a lot of push and investment to lower that cost. And then statewide, there's SB 1075, and this was introduced by Senator Skinner primarily to create a California Clean Hydrogen Hub Fund. So with the Hydrogen Hub federal applications, there's a need for co-investment for each project. So the state is kind of preparing and positioning themselves to supply that funding for those projects. But in it, there is also, to note, an attempt to define, again, clean hydrogen, or what is being known as clean hydrogen, and its potential applications. So all this is going on. There's still some unresolved concerns, right? As you may have heard, and I keep pushing, right? There's zero carbon, there's clean, there's green hydrogen, there's blue, pink. There's a lot of ways to define this. What are we talking about? Can we all get on the same page? And unfortunately, you talk to SoCalGas, you talk to PG&E, you talk to the DOE, you talk to the state, everyone's using a different term. No one is using the same thing. And that is that's a big issue, right? If we're not talking about the same thing, there's going to be a lot of confusion, and we might let in some of that dirty, bad hydrogen that we don't want. There's also water demand and supply concerns to produce green hydrogen. So it's not necessarily the mass balance of water coming in, electrolysis, water coming out. It's sourcing the water to produce hydrogen at the scale needed to build out these pipelines. And in some cases right now, currently in Southern California, we're thinking about, or some of the proposers are putting hydrogen production in the desert. next to renewable energy facilities. It's like, okay, well, where are we getting that water from? How are we piping it? What are the concerns around, obviously, and we live in a very drought, high risk state. So what are those concerns and how do we address them? And then there's climate and health pollutants from burning and transporting hydrogen. So we haven't talked about combustion of hydrogen yet, but that's on the table, and it's one of those potential end uses. And burning hydrogen still produces NOx and other dirty emissions. And hydrogen itself is not necessarily a greenhouse gas, but they're calling it sort of an indirect gas. So it still has some climate warming potential when it gets released in the atmosphere, which could negatively contribute to climate change. So there's still some concerns, even if you have green hydrogen. And then lastly, again, what are these appropriate end uses? What are we saying? Aviation or cargo handling at the port, or sort of that, heavy duty trucking? Like, are those the sectors we want to bank on that need hydrogen? What do we say? What are these sectors that need it? How do we try to frame that properly, again, without letting the bad stuff in? So a lot there, but the next sort of stage of this presentation, I want to kind of get into a real world example, and this is around methane and hydrogen blending. So with everything said, this is a very real and pertinent topic. Worldwide, gas companies are experimenting with blending hydrogen with methane right now to, again, quote unquote, decarbonize their pipelines. SoCal Gas, again, was one of the sort of first in the US to do this, and they've already started piloting it. And of course, the aforementioned PG&E new research facility that would try to get part of that 9.5 billion would specifically look at blending methane and hydrogen at various levels for various end-use applications. And to note, with that PG&E application, they're saying zero carbon hydrogen. Again, not clear what that means. Where does it sit on that scale? What are the sources of production, and what's the method of production? So a lot of question marks there. But we recently, PSR, put out a report that looked at methane and hydrogen blending, specifically for the use in homes. And we have some climate, health, and just financial concerns that we just think makes this solution, again, quote unquote solution, a false one, and not really a viable use of hydrogen. And I want to kind of get through that in the next few slides. So the first one is, again, a lot of this I've already sort of touched on, right? So that first point, it may actually contribute to climate change. So if you're mixing methane and hydrogen, there is a concern over that warming potential. If you're pumping hydrogen through existing methane pipelines, those pipelines already have leakage. So you would expect that alongside methane, hydrogen would also be released, and that again has some warming potential. And then there's also the note that currently the majority of hydrogen is made from fossil fuels, so it's not green. So we're still going to be using a fossil fuel to quote unquote decarbonize a fossil fuel pipeline. Again, doesn't quite make sense in that way. It's also an inefficient use of renewable energy or green hydrogen. And again, this goes back to that direct electrification is a much more effective and efficient way to decarbonize a sector. And this is very, very clear in home settings, right? So we found that a heat pump is about 6 times more efficient than a hydrogen burning boiler. So there is direct electrification solutions that are available now that work and are a lot more efficient and effective to be used in home settings rather than pumping in a methane and hydrogen blend. Again, it's not a very efficient use of hydrogen in that sense. And then a third point, locks in the methane gas system. So if we're blending hydrogen within the existing methane pipelines, we're still going to be using methane, whether that's for the blend or to produce the hydrogen. And that means we're still going to be doing fracking. We're still going to be doing, polluting extraction and refinement processes that impact the health of communities. We're just perpetuating the use of this infrastructure. We're not actually moving away from it, which we need to do. And so that kind of leads to this sort of health concerns, right? So in addition to kind of the broad climate and health impacts, there's still some very real safety concerns for use in homes. Hydrogen ignites more easily and is more explosive than methane gas. Not so I've learned recently it's not necessarily a bigger explosion, but it's just it's a lot more maybe quicker, smaller explosions, but it is very explosive. And again, hydrogen as a gas is also odorless and clear. So there's no direct odorant known to help, perhaps smell a leak. There was even recently a presentation from a professor saying maybe we put ammonia in it because it won't harm the fuel cell technology to produce the hydrogen, but it'll allow us to smell it. But now we're talking about pumping ammonia into homes, which is a very known, chemical irritant, right? So it's not a real solution, right? That's dangerous, impacting the health of communities. And when we talk about burning hydrogen in homes, whether that's with the stove or cooktops, right? It still will produce NOx, and to what degree? There's still some research there, but burning that stuff is not good for you. And burning it alongside methane still, again, this is a methane hydrogen blend. You're still producing chemical pollutants that are going to contribute to asthma, heart disease, and just a lot of bad stuff, right? And we know there is an unequal burden of air pollution, both indoor and outdoor. And this is on low income and BIPOC households, right? They traditionally smaller unit sizes, older homes, there's more people. Sometimes they use a stove oven for supplemental heat. For me, growing up, that was actually something my mom did. Again, she had no idea, but when it got cold, that's what we used. So there's some very real issues here, right? That if we can't just ignore when we think about a promise of a hydrogen solution. And then lastly, just want to note there are some real financial concerns here. So hydrogen itself, again, there's 9.5 billion to try to produce it, get it to scale, reduce the cost. So there's a lot of money there to invest. But then for specifically hydrogen and methane blending for use in homes, there's some concern or lack of information around what extent can you currently blend hydrogen. Right now, it's about 20%, and this isn't even by volume, but they're saying 20% is the safe measure of what you can blend. And at that point, beyond that, you have to replace gas appliances. You have to replace you have to put in new pipelines, new infrastructure to get even greater blends. And as you get to even greater blends, that's when you truly get maybe more GHG reductions. But again, there's still this heavy financial cost and investment into both infrastructure, but also that consumer home appliances level that just doesn't make sense. And a lot of this is going to get passed on to ratepayers, right? We see that time and time again with PG&E or these other utilities. They pass these costs on to ratepayers. And why, right? Again, when there's maybe something a little bit better. And that a little bit better is building electrification solutions, right? We're talking about induction cooktops, heat pumps, things that are readily available. Yes, they might be expensive. They might be maybe cost prohibitive in some cases, but why are we going to pump all this money into a methane hydrogen blend in homes when we have that will still produce NOx, might even put ammonia in homes, might be more explosive, it's going to have this heavy burden, versus something that's clean, direct, is not going to do any of that, right? There's a real solution that makes a lot more sense from climate, health, and financial perspective. And that's this. Really quickly, I want to also just talk about hydrogen blending in natural gas power plants. So there's a lot of talk of that now too. It's not just in homes, but also using some blend to decarbonize power plants. But again, a lot of the same concerns are relevant here, right? How are we defining hydrogen? Is it truly green? Even if we're pumping it there's going to be leakage concerns about hydrogen and that global warming potential in the atmosphere. NOx emissions will happen when burned. And if we're talking about the impact on local communities, especially these communities located near power plants, there are a lot of EJ communities, we're still going to be harming them. We're still producing air pollutants that will impact their health. So again, truly, are we solving this climate and health crisis issue? Then lastly, right, there's that high cost investment in infrastructure that turbines currently, they're just not there yet, but money is getting invested to get to burn a methane and hydrogen blend and higher blends. It's not just kind of what's existing technology can't just produce or run on hydrogen methane blends. All right, so a lot of that. Just want to leave you with a few last considerations moving forward, and we can jump into the Q&A. Only green hydrogen should be considered, and so this is our perspective. But even it has unresolved concerns. Again, that sort of water supply and demand. Building electrification solutions are a much more effective strategy to decarbonize a home. Again, when we talk about the use of hydrogen, do we really want to pipe it into homes, blending it with methane, or do we want to pursue building electrification? Hydrogen used in combustion, whether that's in homes or in power plants, still produces NOx emissions. This is a fact and still something we need to address. Even, again, we need to make sure that we are not just forgetting about the health of communities and air quality. Local communities and community-based organizations must be included in the decision-making process. And this is, again, more so in reference to the hydrogen hub applications, which are happening right now. There's discussions moving very, very quickly. How much real engagement and inclusion is there with community groups? That's a real question that we should be asking. And then above all, right, hydrogen just must not be used to extend the life of methane or other fossil fuel infrastructure that has a disproportionate impact on low-income and BIPOC communities. That's, again, just something we need to be very clear on when we talk about hydrogen as a potential climate solution. And that's it. I hope that gives a good foundation for a Q&A.
Thank you, Gregory. So I see a lot of questions in the chat, in the Q&A box, and then I also see a hand raise. Maybe let's start with the questions in the Q&A box, and then we can go to the attendees with the hand raise, and folks can unmute themselves to ask the question. So the first question is from John Shutt and Vanessa. We're curious if hydrogen is practical for vehicles.
That's a great question. Right. I mean, if you're talking consumer vehicles, there is, I think the latest maybe research is pointing that battery electric might win out, might be more effective. Is certainly the ability to charge at home and have various charging stations might appeal a little bit better for consumers and sort of just you and I, right, the public. But perhaps in larger duty vehicles, like large, like freight shipping trucks or kind of larger vehicles in that sense, that might win out. That might be a good application for hydrogen. But again, that's sort of to be determined, and something where, will innovation in battery technology, supersede the investment into hydrogen at this point.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add just to what you said earlier, there are already a lot of EV options available, and they're so much more efficient and cheaper to purchase than operating with hydrogen vehicles. So like you said, it could be in the future, but we already have very practical options. Next question, have you evaluated hydrogen embrittlement of steel pipe? If so, to what level could hydrogen be blended with methane without embrittling existing natural gas pipelines?
Yeah, that's a great question, and definitely it's in our paper and something we've looked at. It seems to be that hydrogen is more corrosive or can lead to embrittlement of pipelines. I think there was research that was put out that said the timeline of that is actually like really long. So we're talking about a scale of maybe, 80 to 100 years where that embrittlement would really come into play. But that's starting at like, maybe an ideal situation or something that isn't truly practical. And I think in most cases, if we're looking at pumping hydrogen through existing methane pipelines, do we know the condition of those methane pipelines, right? We live in a very earthquake prone area. There's those pipelines are always cracking, or they might be worse than we imagine. So if perhaps they're worse than we imagine and we throw hydrogen in there, it could maybe lead to some real challenges and concerns a lot more faster than we thought. So there is concern over there in that sense. And I think it's definitely more at the practical level, right? Of if we're pumping it into existing infrastructure. That's why a lot of these proposals right now are talking about building out brand new pipelines for hydrogen specifically. Of course, there'll still be embrittlement, there'll still be leakage over time, but in that sense, it would be such a wide picture or scope.
Thank you. And then there's also the issue of the colorless, tasteless, and odorless gas that we would still have to figure out as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Next question. Would be very interested in if the speakers can speak about hydrogen projects and considerations in the Bay Area.
So I am not again, I'm based in LA in Southern California, so I've been more involved in the conversations down here. Melissa, I'd be curious if you've heard of anything maybe more recent in the Bay Area, but I haven't seen much. I feel like the PG&E press release that they put out, I think it was early May, around the blending facility in Lodi, was kind of the first big thing I've heard in Northern California around them pursuing hydrogen. PG&E has been talking about it for some time, but I feel like that was sort of the first big initiative I've heard around hydrogen in the area.
Yeah, same. I haven't heard any. The only one that I have heard is the one that is in Lodi that you have already talked about, which we're grateful for. So hopefully we can keep it that way, and then fight the projects in SoCal. Next question. Can you highlight the relation between solar wind as an aid to hydrogen production?
Yeah, so I guess whoever asked that, if you'd like to maybe clarify to like in what way you would like, or like in how that relationship you would like to find. I mean, in my mind, I think of that question maybe around the sort of the method of production, right? So renewables in that sense, wind, solar, would be feedstocks for hydrogen production, and this is green hydrogen production. So again, when we talk about hydrogen, you can use methane, you can use natural gas, you can use coal, right? You can use so many things, but you can also use green or electricity through this process of electrolysis. And how you get that electricity can be, from a hamster running on a wheel, right? Or it can be, from solar or wind. So in that sense, renewables can power and create green hydrogen.
Thank you. Next question. What are the sources for water, and what would be the ongoing need for water?
Yeah, no, exactly. That is still the big question mark. No one really has an answer for. It's kind of one of those that people keep punting and saying, yeah, we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. So the big thing around the consideration of hydrogen is, especially if we're saying green hydrogen, right? Which again is using renewables. So we want to have that co-locate hydrogen facility and hydrogen production next to those renewables. So again, at least in Southern California, a lot of our renewables are in the desert. So we're saying, okay, we can build out a hydrogen facility, or right now that's being proposed by some of these applicants for the hydrogen hub process. We would co-locate a green hydrogen facility next to these renewable sites. But again, it's in the middle of the desert. So where are we getting that water from? Is it from our, maybe an existing waterway, a reservoir? I have no idea, and no one quite knows. They said some cases, oh yeah, there's water there. There's sources we could pipe from. But again, there's still a big question mark. No real study has been done about the amount of water needed that would need to be diverted there. what that means for, where that the water that would otherwise be going, right? Is it coming to, maybe some farm, maybe it's coming to the population. There's still a lot of question marks of water usage. Again, that supply of where do we get it, and what does that mean for other areas that aren't getting that water?
Yeah, and I have some stats on me right now to answer that question as well. The second question, the ongoing need for water to generate 1 kilogram of hydrogen through electrolysis, that would use 9 kilograms of water. And so for context, supplying hydrogen for a 288 megawatt power plant using 100% hydrogen would require the equivalent of an Olympic-sized swimming pool every 12 hours. So that is a lot of water that would be needed and would be very difficult in these times, especially when we are in a drought and especially in the desert. Next question, how is burning hydrogen not green? You just get water.
Sorry, what was that? Could you repeat that one?
How is burning hydrogen not green? You just get water.
How is burning hydrogen not green? You just get water. So it sounds like maybe there is some confusion there. So burning hydrogen, you're literally burning a fuel, right? So there is no water that's produced from combustion. You're just taking hydrogen as a gas and burning it. And in that case, the emissions would be NOx, maybe some other pollutants. You get water through electrolysis. So that's a separate process. And water, nothing is burned in that sense. You're just taking green electricity, water, and you're running it through a membrane, and you're using sort of the electricity to pull out a hydrogen, and that creates hydrogen fuel. And then you also get water. So in that sense, electrolysis is where you get that water output. But in combustion, it's not. It's just you're straight up burning a fuel, and you're just getting flames and other pollutants.
Thank you. And yeah, just to add, I think that speaks to how complicated this subject matter is. There are so many different, even just simply colors of hydrogen. There's green, there's grays, there's the blues, and so many more. And like Gregory said in his presentation, there are so many names to hydrogen alone. It is a very complicated subject that utilities are probably making more complicated by the way that they are presenting themselves, and using it as a way of potentially even greenwashing. Next question, what about using hydrogen as a backup in case of electric power outages?
Yeah, so that is another potential use right now. So again, hydrogen, given its characteristics, it could be stored and used to power or to create power capacity for the grid. So there's various ways to do that, though, right? You can produce hydrogen, store it as a fuel. Right now, they're saying that hydrogen can be stored naturally in like underground salt caverns, and LADWP has a project in Utah that's doing just that. So there's some interesting ways you can store hydrogen. But if you can do it like that, right, you can then use hydrogen to power a fuel cell, and that can produce clean electricity, during the night or whenever there's a higher demand that renewables can't meet. So there's a potential there, but then there's also potential to store hydrogen and then use it in combustion in methane blended power plants. And again, that's still producing NOx. So again, this is that confusion, right? It's not necessarily the production, but also the end use technology. Are you using maybe something like a fuel cell, which is clean, or are you using it in combustion, which is dirty? So there's different ways you can do it. But yes, hydrogen as a form of storage is definitely a potential application that a lot of groups are looking at.
Thank you. The next one is a comment from Margin A. Why did anyone even think about adding up to 20% hydrogen to methane, aka natural gas? It makes no logical sense.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Yeah, Margin A could do this presentation probably better than me at this point. She absolutely right. Again, this is when we look at the various considerations of hydrogen and its end uses, right? Like I think when we talk about aviation or some of those other industries, you could probably make a reasonable case where if we gave the same presentation and use that as an example, we might say, yeah, maybe, right? Like this is maybe what we need. But when we look at blending in home use, it's one of those just, this doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense from so many angles. And again, it's just something, but yet it's still happening, right? People are still pursuing it, which is goes to show, right? The desire to keep business models alive and keep the fossil fuel infrastructure going.
Mm-hmm. Next question from Rick. It seems clear that there will be a decade or more of transitioning to electrification. Millions of homes will need heat pumps and are not available in large quantities at the moment, skilled installers are limited and costly. While a new hydrogen pipeline system is costly, why isn't blending hydrogen and methane to reduce GHG emissions using the existing natural gas system a good solution for the next decade or so?
So I think in an ideal scenario where we could maybe have full control, where we could literally turn on a tap, input hydrogen, we blend it, and then we can turn it off when we have other things going ready, like a heat pump or everyone's online. Yeah, I can see that, right? I think there's more practical considerations here, aside from what we all just talked about. There's some real accountability that is lost in this sense. And the fossil fuel industry, if for those on the call, if you are familiar with the promise of natural gas, right? Or even we're calling it natural gas, right? It's methane. And the promise that this is going to be a little cleaner, it's going to help us transition. The thing is, though, when we invest in this infrastructure, these are decades long infrastructure that we're investing in, right? If we're building out a whole new pipeline for hydrogen, that's something, that investment, we're expecting that life to live for 20 plus years, right? So this is a very long timeline when we're talking about the next year. And currently, right, even if we wanted to transition, start mixing hydrogen methane blending today and using that in homes, there's not even enough green hydrogen available. We're still using dirty hydrogen, right? So if we're using dirty hydrogen with methane, we're still using fossil fuels. There is no tangible greenhouse benefit right now if we would make that over the next year. Just green hydrogen isn't even available at the quantity needed, right? Over the next decade is when we hope to, through all these various DOE initiatives, to get green hydrogen at the cost level, but also the supply level to do, do something at that scale. But that's not even there. So in the next decade, let's just bring the cost down of these heat pumps. Let's invest in getting these other solutions out that have more climate health benefits than methane and hydrogen blending. So a lot of considerations there, but there's a lot of, I think, there's a practical sense here that I think we need to remember.
Thank you. The next question is from Pam. Do you know if clean hydrogen or blending can or is being used to refine biosolids? And if so, what are the risks, especially for folks who live near a refinery like Phillips 66?
I can't say I have a good answer to that question. I do know at the very least that some, or at least in the state of California, biomethane is considered green or potentially a green feedstock for something like hydrogen. So it very well could be used as a way to produce hydrogen. And I think that is on the table and something that's being discussed. And in that case, right, if we're committing to that and we're committing to building out hydrogen infrastructure, that means those plants are still going to keep operating. That means we're still going to be polluting. We're still going to be impacting the lives of those communities next to them. So it's all stuff we want to move away from. And just because we might maybe save some on the carbon side of things or GHG things, if again, for us, if we're not also taking care of that health component, right, those pollutants, it's not a real solution. We need solutions that solve both challenges, and we can't leave anybody behind.
Yeah, for sure. This is definitely something that you touched on in the presentation as well. There are already many of the existing and the proposed projects that we see are located near existing gas and oil chemical facilities, and these homes are already disproportionately located in places that are of communities of color. So we definitely need to make sure that these projects are carefully evaluated and that they're not just an attempt by the fossil fuel industry to continue to extend the life of the fossil fuel projects. Next question, when I see methane, I see cattle feedlots. How do you capture it for disposal? Am I reading that question? Am I asking that question correctly, Phil? Or Gregory, does that question make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if how much I can answer that, to be honest. Yeah, if there's a clarification you could add to that question, that would be great. I mean, again, I think that sort of relates to the previous question in the sense that biomethane, right? Things like from animal waste or human waste or, agricultural residue, that stuff could be used as a feedstock to produce green hydrogen. And in the state of California, it seems like that's being allowed. But so I don't know if I'm answering that correctly or if there's something a little bit more nuanced to it.
Yeah, Phil, if there's a follow-up question, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A box. And if we don't get to it, we'll definitely get to, we'll answer questions offline as well. Next question, how far off are we from actually implementing increased use of hydrogen?
Pretty far off. We just don't have again, the supply just isn't there. Even if we wanted to today, right? Like say, again, ideal scenario, we turn on the tap, green hydrogen flows. Like we don't have that capability. There's one that is just the supply isn't there, the infrastructure that isn't there, and the infrastructure is to produce, transport, and distribute it. Like none of that really is there. Again, California is probably more advanced than most states. With the consumer vehicles, right? I believe it's called the hydrogen highway, right? We have hydrogen fuel cell stations up and down the country. I'm sorry, the state, with that you can fill up at, and that has some network. But beyond that, there's really not much.
Thank you. Next question. It is known that existing methane gas piping infrastructure leaks a significant amount of methane. Hydrogen is a smaller molecule, so does it leak more easily than methane? And how much leakage of hydrogen should be expected?
Yeah, so I would point you to there, and we can send this in a follow-up to this conversation. There's a EDF put out a great study on this topic around leakage and sort of the warming potential. So I'll leave the details to that paper, but what I can say is that yes, right, the sort of premise of hydrogen is a smaller molecule, therefore, it'll probably pass through at a faster rate in these pipes that are cracked, that are already leaking methane. It was interesting. A well-known professor from UCI recently spoke out. I think it was a air quality management, South Coast Air Quality Management meeting, saying that he has done some research and found that that's not necessarily the case, that it seems like it might be almost the same as methane. So I guess suffice it to say, there's a lot of research still that needs to be discussed. But yes, there is some real concern that hydrogen would leak at a faster rate, or at least would escape at maybe higher volumes, right? Even though they're smaller molecules, there might be more of it escaping. So there is still some research that needs to be done there.
Yeah, thank you. And I also wanted to add, any hydrogen leaks could also undermine any of the benefits that we can even see from green hydrogen. So I feel like it will just cancel each other out from that perspective.
Yeah.
Josh asked, does hydrogen use in vehicles contribute to NOx too?
So end use, no, right? So vehicles that are using hydrogen, they use fuel cell technology. So that's just producing water. It's sort of it's not directly battery electric, but it still uses a battery on board. So hydrogen is used to power that battery, but there is no combustion of hydrogen. You only get NOx emissions from hydrogen when you're burning it or combusting it. That is not to say, though, that on the production side, right, say that vehicle that's getting that hydrogen if that hydrogen was produced through maybe natural gas or coal or something else that's dirty, that is polluting, technically that fuel would still carry some of those emissions, right? So at least on the end use things, when you're driving around, you're not producing NOx. But maybe on the production side of where you're getting that hydrogen, it might still be polluting.
Thank you. Next question. We're also curious if we can use either fresh water or ocean water for generating hydrogen, and if you need to desalinate first if using ocean water.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure you can't use I guess salinated water, right? Ocean water. It has to be clean, or at least without salt. So it doesn't need to be necessarily like drinking water quality, but it does, I think, at least potable, maybe reuse, at least to a certain standard, would work.
Is ammonia a better or more practical fuel than hydrogen?
Ooh, in what setting, what case? If you can respond a little bit or add some clarifying parameters to that question, that'd be great. It's hard for me to say because in some cases, right, if we're talking like chemical manufacturing or something really in that sense, I might not have a good answer to it. But if you could be a little bit more clear, that might help my answer.
Roger, if you can add some more clarity into your question, we can answer that later on as well. Next question. Hydrogen has been touted as a solution for trucking and cargo on water. Can you address this in more detail?
On water, so I'm assuming like for shipping, right? For maritime, yeah. So yes, exactly. So right now, imagine trying to power a cargo ship with battery technology. Like it's not practical. Just in terms of the amount of batteries you would need, the level of charge, and the amount of charge you would need to gain, like to refuel, right, or recharge. It's just not practical. So in the sense where hydrogen could potentially play a role there, you would use very much the technology that's used currently in hydrogen vehicles that consumers can buy, right, or driving around right now, and that's a fuel cell technology. So you could have fuel cells on board. You could pump in hydrogen, right, as a gas, as a fuel, and then you could have fuel cells on board that can convert that into energy and electricity, and that powers the ship. So there is some potential there where that could be used. And again, that wouldn't produce any emissions, that whole process, at least on board, right? Where you're getting that hydrogen from, if it's dirty, even the life cycle, carbon analysis of those fuel cells and all of that, right? There's still carbon components to it, but at least for that end use production on site on that ship, it would be zero emission.
Great, next question. And you touched on this question a little earlier. While electrification is ideal for now, where does PSR see the electricity coming from? Solar and wind are known, but not sufficient. You recognize the storage issue with batteries. Hydrogen has been suggested as a storage mechanism as well as an independent fuel source, but we don't want to have natural gas plants burning 100% natural gas constantly to provide electricity.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. I'll do my best to answer, and I'll be careful not to make a statement on behalf of the entire organization of PSR, because I don't think I can do that. But yeah, so look, we believe that there are pathways to get to almost 100% renewable energy, and I think that is our primary goal and target, and something certainly the state has. Many studies have been out to say give us pathways to get to that, and we want to pursue that, right? Because renewable energy is a climate solution, but also a health solution, right? Because we are not burning anything, we're not extracting anything, and all of that stuff, if we would, right, with fossil fuels, would harm the health of communities. And again, for us, we look at the solution both sides, health and climate. So clean renewables are great. Now we recognize, yeah, maybe in some cases, right, there is that last 10, 15% that we might need alternatives, or at least to get creative with the use of renewables. And maybe hydrogen is there. PSR does not have an official stance or statement on that, and I can't speak to that as we do. But I think there are ways that we must consider, looking at alternatives, right? But again, these alternatives have to also have a health benefit to them, right? We can't just say we're going to keep these plants open and transition them to hydrogen, but we're still producing the same level of NOx emissions or worse. That's not, we're still impacting communities, and we're still impacting the health of really disadvantaged, impacted communities already historically. So we're going to keep harming those communities to get a climate benefit. Again, we take the stance that we have to keep those considerations in mind for every climate solution in our path to get to 100% renewable energy.
Great. Thank you, Gregory. So we're at 12 o'clock. Thank you all for sticking around and asking such great questions. I'm going to drop Gregory's contact and my contact into the chat box. So feel free to reach out to us if you all have further questions. And then I know that there are folks who asked some questions that we didn't get a chance to get to. Can you please email them to us so we can answer them as well? And with that, thank you so much. Are there any closing thoughts or closing comments that you wanted to share, Gregory?
No, thank you, Melissa. Thank you, everyone that helped put this together. Thank you all for joining. I know I talked a lot, and there's still a lot we could talk about. As I said, it's a very nuanced and so many different aspects of this conversation could get into. As Melissa said, feel free to email me directly. I'll do my best to answer questions or point you to some resources to help out. But thank you again for attending.
Thank you all. Bye.